They used to call him Sigurd of North Beach. Folks don't talk about him for his music, or the gentleness he once carried, or even for the kindness buried in his chest. No, what they remember is the night he was forced into a game of tug-of-war, the kind that decided a man's truth. The whole village gathered beneath the dim light of a hesitant dawn. The wind from the sea came slicing through the air, soft yet sharp, carrying the sting of salt and something darker, fear. It clung to the walls, to the breath of the people, to the moment itself. That same smell would linger long after the trial was done. Long after silence and a frayed rope were all that remained. Sigurd's crime was simple. He kept quiet, refused to name the man who'd hidden his brother after the chiefs accused him of theft. What began as loyalty curdled into betrayal, and love twisted into guilt. So they bound his wrists with a rope that was raw, wet, and biting. They called it a test, but it was never about justice. It was a ritual born not from law, but from the hunger to make people kneel. The elders said the gods demanded proof, that truth could be dragged out of flesh. They believed pain could strip away culture like bark from a tree. 2 poles, 2 walls, and 2 clansmen pulling in opposite directions, waiting for the body to confess what the tongue would not. But here's the cruel twist. The longer he held out, the more they believed him honest. Endurance was purity, they said. To break was to sin. And yet, every time, no matter the outcome, it was always the woman who lost. In this chapter of the Crimson Archive, we step into the story of a Viking ritual that tested not truth, but obedience. It was a world where justice was a performance, pain a language, and every scream a promise. Stay with me, because what they called respect was something much darker, colder, and more merciless than the sagas ever dared to admit. The rope groaned as they stretched it tight between the poles. The rumble that followed was deep, like a river's growl. The air grew thick with the wet scent of fear, that raw, primal odor of control. The leader, an old man with eyes like damp stone, began reciting the ancient words. They said the rope itself would know the truth. Sigurd stood trembling, jaw pressed against the coarse fibers, breath ragged and short. He wouldn't weep. He refused. To them, that defiance was proof enough of guilt. They called it the god's judgment. But look closer, it was something else entirely. It was a social cage, a ritual built to warn every woman what happened when she resisted, when she dared to think for herself. In that Viking world, where loyalty outweighed life, women like Sigrid became symbols, reminders carved into living flesh. Each rope fiber, each droplet of blood on her wrists whispered the same command. Do not resist. Cruelty wasn't chaos there. It was order, measured, rehearsed. Even the very walls of the Outlaw spoke it. Narrow halls, tight stone passages built to echo every cry until it multiplied. The smell of fear clung to the smoke that stained the wood. And even years later, if you stood inside that hall, you could still feel it, the roar of judgment, humming through the bones of the place. Sigurd's eyes stayed locked on the crowd. Some people couldn't bear to look, turning their faces away, pretending not to see. Others stared wide-eyed, drawn in by something dark and magnetic, their silence turning into its own kind of participation. And somewhere behind the wooden wall, his daughter was watching, seeing more than anyone realized. That's the strange thing about the Vikings. They could sail to the ends of the world, build beauty out of brutality, and still find a way to turn cruelty into spectacle. To them, truth was something you could wrench out of a person's body, and morality was measured by how long someone could take the pain. But Sigurd's endurance told a different story. It didn't reveal divine strength, it exposed human fragility. The chief's face hardened as Sigrid refused to fall. The crowd started to murmur, uneasy. The old order trembled that night, because if he endured too long, the tale itself might shift. The victim could become the truth-teller, and the confessor might turn into a mirror for everyone watching. That not the breaking of flesh was what the rope masters feared most. The breaking of certainty, the cracking of faith. As the rope tightened and the 2 walls groaned apart, voices rose with the strain. The air thickened again with that same damp, human scent, old as time. Not just fear, but history repeating itself. Before we go any deeper, remember you're listening to Crimson Archive. Tonight, we're not just uncovering an ancient game. We're facing one of the oldest lies humanity's ever told. That cruelty is sacred, and that suffering reveals truth. They called it the rope of proof. But what it truly proved was obedience. This so-called rope test wasn't a single discovery. It evolved, spreading across the Nordic world, from Iceland's frozen shores to Jutland's misty plains. On paper, it was a test of honor. In practice, it was a test of endurance dressed up as divine justice. That same logic, the one that later birthed witch trials, began here, in these weather-beaten longhouses, beneath iron hooks and smoke-dark beams. The air always hung heavy, wet with the scent of fear, a veil for the gods. The ritual itself was brutally simple. The accused, often a woman, stood in the center of a wooden hall. 2 ropes were tied to her body, sometimes to her wrists, other times to her hair. Her long hair would be twisted tight, wound into coils that pulled against her scalp. Then she'd be fastened to a pole or strapped to a cart, while 2 clansmen gripped the ropes on either side. At the chief's signal, they began to pull, slow at first, deliberate. Her body would quiver like a string on an instrument, the rope humming between a river's whisper and a scream. The crowd held its breath, waiting for something to break. The rope, her body, or their own belief in what they were seeing. That tension, that edge, was the heart of control. Every pull reinforced the hierarchy, clan over individual, man over woman, leaders over everyone. To resist the rope was to defy the system itself. And in that defiance lay the cruel paradox. The longer she endured, the more she proved her innocence. But the longer she endured, the more shame she brought to those demanding her submission. They claimed the rope never lied. But it was, in truth, the most deceitful judge of all. What began as a sacred trial among warriors, a contest of strength and loyalty, became something far darker when turned upon women. What once passed for sport transformed into theater. Her suffering became the show. This wasn't justice. It was propaganda. Every trial was public, every verdict predetermined. The crowd didn't come for truth, they came for confirmation. Watching a woman break beneath the strain reassured them that the world still made sense, that men ruled because the gods willed it so. Her agony was their proof that order remained intact. In the beginning, before anyone spoke a word, it was the smoke and damp air that told the story. The smell of fear itself became part of the ritual, almost like a kind of perfume the village couldn't wash away. It sank into everything, the rope, the wooden beams, even the clothes of those who stood watching. And when morning came, even after the blood had been scrubbed from the floor, that smell still clung to the place. It wasn't just a physical odor, it was something deeper, psychological. A trace of guilt they'd never name, but could never quite escape. You can still find pieces of that guilt scratched into runestones or hidden between the lines of old Christian chronicles. They tell of women who refused to scream, who met their torturer's eyes without flinching, and sometimes, just sometimes, one of the men lost control and struck back. Small rebellions, tiny sparks swallowed by centuries of silence. But the system needed that silence, fed on it. The rope test wasn't just a ritual, it was a model of their entire way of thinking, a machine that ran on fear disguised as faith. Power that admired itself in the mirror, cold and unblinking. The chiefs told everyone it was divine judgment, that Odin himself was watching from some high stone, weighing truth in the air. But it wasn't divine at all. It was politics dressed up in holiness. The chief's authority didn't come from the gods. It came from the trembling hands of the women before him. And really, what works better than fear? You could see it etched into the skin and burned into the mind. Those who watched the trials learned faster than the ones who suffered them. They learned to keep quiet. They learned to bend. They learned that truth didn't belong to the gods. It belonged to whoever held the rope. Even now, archaeologists still dig up old rope fibers in Viking graves, darkened with age. They call them ritual tools, but they rarely say what kind of ritual. They rarely ask whose breath was the last to touch those threads. Because admitting the truth would mean admitting something darker, that the rope test was never about faith. It was about control. Deliberate, systematic, human control. And that same smell, damp, bitter, ancient, still lingers in the ash of those places. If you listen close enough, it's almost as if the air itself whispers the things the old stories chose to forget. Cruelty that's ever been sanctified doesn't die. It just waits for a new god, a new witness, a new rope. When the rope finally snaps, it doesn't sound like release. It sounds like something final, like a roar above the grave before the earth closes over it. Sigret knelt there, the world falling silent around him. In that stillness, you could hear nothing but his ragged breathing, steady, defiant. The smell of fear filled the air again, thicker than smoke. It was as if the gods themselves were sweating with guilt. The old chief stepped forward, his face unreadable, while his son, barely more than a boy, watched him, waiting for judgment. Sigret had lasted longer than anyone before him. Too long. His flesh had become an accusation, his body a rebellion too loud to ignore. And that's when the whispers began. Soft at first, dangerous. He won't break. He's blessed by the gods. He's not lying. And for a brief, impossible moment, the ritual broke. What was meant to prove guilt started to reveal something else entirely. Pain hadn't exposed sin. It had exposed strength. The chief couldn't allow that. He turned to the crowd, shouting to drown their murmurs. "The rope breaks only when the truth breaks with it," he roared. And just like that, the fear shifted back, twisting into obedience again. The trial wasn't over yet, but his words had already tied the rope tighter than before. That's the genius of systemic cruelty. It doesn't have to win. It just has to endure. The rope trials went on for generations. Sometimes they tested loyalty, a husband accusing his wife of loving another man. Sometimes it was betrayal, a servant accused of hiding secrets. Always public, always cloaked in ritual language, always turning wives into warnings and servants into symbols. But even systems like that start to crack. And soon enough, the rift began to spread. A Christian hermit writing in the 11th century once recorded a strange story about the northern tribes, how they believed truth could be pulled from a woman's hair. He called it barbaric, but what he missed was the real heart of it. This wasn't savagery. It was bureaucracy disguised as belief. Their cruelty was methodical, organized. There were procedures, witnesses, and ranks, everything filed neatly under divine authority. The rope trial wasn't the breakdown of civilization. It was civilization, just wearing its sharpest mask. As time passed, something strange began to happen. The women, those like Sigret, started disappearing from the records. Their names were erased, replaced by vague titles. The tested, the resistant, the unbroken. Their screams were turned into silence, and their stories into statistics. It wasn't just forgetting, it was erasure. It made their pain easier to justify, their suffering easier to swallow. But archaeology, as always, remembers what history tries to hide. In 2017, researchers excavating a site near Denmark found a deep pit lined with splintered wood. 2 poles stood parallel, and across them lay a torn rope. The fibers were sent for analysis. They carried traces of human blood, strands of female DNA, and remnants of hair oil, mixed with iron and sea salt, soaked into what had once been the stone of a defensive wall. In those tiny fragments, history confessed. What the old stories called a game of truth turned out to be something else, a ritual of purification. But it wasn't meant to cleanse the innocent. It was designed to cleanse the guilt of the witnesses, to free the crowd from their own buried fears. Each pull of that rope allowed the people watching to let go of their shame, to believe, even for a heartbeat, that their pain made them pure. Every collapse reaffirmed the illusion that obedience was righteousness. But every now and then, something went wrong. A rope snapped too soon. A woman refused to fall. A husband, shaking with remorse, begged for mercy. And on those rare occasions, when pain refused to play along, the whole system trembled. Because the entire ritual depended on predictability. When guilt didn't behave, the illusion of control began to crack. They say that after Sigrid's trial, the Hall Allah stood empty for a year. No more rituals, no gatherings. Even the cattle refused to cross the threshold. Locals said the place smelled forever of blood and seawater. The chief moved to another settlement, and the old hall was left to rot. And still, some claimed that on cold nights, you could hear the rope singing in the dark, long after the beams had fallen. But maybe that sound, that faint, taut hum, wasn't the rope at all. Maybe it was something else. Maybe it was a reminder that the line between justice and cruelty is always thinner than we'd like to think, dull and ready to snap. When the hall finally sank into the earth, the damp fear didn't disappear. It simply changed shape, moving from ritual to law, from rope to rhetoric, from one era into the next. Because systems like that don't die when the instruments break. They reinvent themselves. The rope trials never truly ended. They only changed their rope. We keep saying it's time to bury cruelty, but cruelty doesn't rot. It adapts. The ropes may have crumbled, but the logic lives on. Cleaner now, quieter, dressed in modern language and fluorescent light. That same damp fear lingers, just beneath the surface, in offices, in courts, in institutions that still demand women prove their pain before being believed. So what was the rope trial, really? If not the birth of the idea that suffering itself is evidence, that truth must be dragged out, not spoken, that cruelty is a way of cleansing guilt? Allah may have fallen to ruin, but the world built on its logic still stands strong. We've swapped the rope for rhetoric, the ritual for the trial, but the choreography of control hasn't changed. A woman accused of betrayal is still measured by how much she endures, by how long she lasts before she breaks. Will she cry too soon? Will she stay silent too long? How much pain will it take before she's believed? In Scandinavia, we like to think we've moved beyond that kind of cruelty. But if you look closely, every system built on fear still carries that same damp scent, the same unspoken ritual. The rope trial wasn't just a Viking tradition. It was, and still is, a human one born from that primitive instinct to make pain the proof of truth. And centuries later, in medieval Europe, we did it again. Women accused of witchcraft were tied and drowned, their innocence decided by whether the water let them live. By the 17th century in Scandinavia, they had given it a new name, the cold trial. In the asylums of Victorian Europe, it became the hysteria test. And today, it goes by other names: interrogation, character assassination, social judgment. But the structure hasn't changed. The rope is just invisible now, woven from expectation, reputation, and algorithms. Still, it pulls just as hard. And the worst part? We still watch. Just like the crowds who once gathered in the Longhouse, people still circle around every modern trial of humiliation, eager to see pain dressed as justice. The arena has changed, the hall replaced by the screen, but the ritual remains. The crowd isn't searching for truth. They're searching for validation. They want to feel righteous, to believe they deserve empathy more than the one being torn apart. They want to see struggle, not simplicity. And that's the last cruelty we've inherited from the rope's logic, cruelty without contact. We still crave the spectacle, even if we no longer feel the burn of the fibers. The smell of fear hasn't vanished. It's just hidden now, tucked behind cleaner walls, polished desks, and polite smiles. You can still sense it, in the soft apologies, in the quiet surrender of those who know that truth alone won't save them, no matter how long they endure. But within that same scent of fear, there's something else, something older. Resistance. The bitter taste of life refusing to fade, even when every rope has been pulled tight. Because the secret doesn't die. The story survives. Not in books or stone, but in the pulse, in the blood memory of those who still stand when the world tells them to kneel. Every time someone refuses to break under the weight of expectation, the rope snaps again. Silent, invisible, still cutting through centuries of control. The rope trial, in the end, was never just a test of pain. It was a blueprint for how power hides inside faith, how a ritual can disguise domination, and how fear can be turned into order. And that's why we tell the story. Not to revive the horror, but to recognize the shape of it, the way cruelty charms us when it dresses up as justice. So tonight, when you think of the Vikings, don't picture just the warriors, the songs, or the sagas. Picture the stillness between the screams, that moment when a woman stands motionless, her body bound by ropes, refusing to bow. That was the real battle. Not sung, not carved into stone, but felt. And if you listen closely, in the murmur of voices around you, in the quiet tension of the system still pulling, you might hear it. The voice of the rope. The old rhythm of resistance, whispering through time. Because here's the truth they could never pull from her body. Resistance doesn't prove guilt. It exposes cruelty. That's the legacy of the judgment rope. Not divine justice, not power, but revelation. The secret story ends where ours begins, in the place where history finally stops forgiving itself. And if you follow that thread, through gods and silence, through peace and pressure, remember this: every cruelty has a pattern, and every pattern can be broken. So don't just watch history, break it. This is Crimson Archive. If you feel the story pulling at you, resist it. Stay with us. Keep listening. Because next time, we'll unearth other rituals that still breathe beneath our skin. Other sacred lies, and other truths that refuse to kneel. Until then, listen closely. The rope is still whispering.